thought the reading of the will would be a formality. A quiet, uncomfortable afternoon in a lawyer's office, a few signatures, maybe an awkward drive home. I had no idea that the moment the attorney opened that folder, my husband would go completely still beside me, the way a person goes still and they already know what's coming, and that what I was about to hear would expose not one betrayal, but three, each one buried beneath the last, like layers of rot beneath a clean coat of paint. The most shattering part wasn't what Gerald Marsh had written about me. It was what he had written about my husband. And it was the fact that my husband had read it 6 weeks before his father died, said nothing, and continued to sleep next to me every single night as though the world were unchanged. Gerald Marsh had never liked me. I want to say that plainly because it matters. He had never pretended otherwise, never made the gracious effort that even difficult people sometimes make for the sake of their children's happiness. From the first evening Thomas brought me to meet his parents, a Sunday roast in the Marsh family home in Whitfield, a house that smelled of old wood and lemon polish, and something underneath that I could not name, something faintly metallic and tightly controlled. Gerald had looked at me across the table with eyes that were pale and measuring and entirely without warmth. And he had said, "Thomas tells me you work in finance." He'd said it the way some men say, "Of course you do," with a faint tightening at the corners of the mouth that made the sentence mean something other than what it appeared to mean. I was 29. I was a junior portfolio manager at a mid-sized investment firm in the city. I was careful with money, good at numbers, genuinely proud of the career I had built from nothing. My parents had not been wealthy. There had been no family connections, no useful introductions. Everything I had earned through 7 years of early mornings and late evenings, and the specific kind of determination that comes from knowing there is no safety net beneath you. None of that seemed to matter to Gerald Marsh. What seemed to matter to Gerald Marsh was that I was not from the right kind of family, did not have the right kind of last name, and had, in his view, expressed once and never retracted, arrived in his son's life with the clear intention of getting my hands on the Marsh estate. The Marsh estate. It sounds grander than it was, and yet it was not nothing. Gerald had built his money in property development over 30 years. Not spectacular wealth, not the kind that makes newspapers, but the solid, unglamorous kind that accumulates quietly in the form of 3 rental properties in the north of the city, a substantial savings portfolio, and the family home itself, a 4-bedroom detached house in Whitfield that had been in his wife's family before it was in his, and that Gerald guarded with a possessiveness that went well beyond normal attachment to a home. He had made it clear in the early years of my relationship with Thomas that he intended to leave everything to Thomas outright, that the notion of a daughter-in-law having any claim on Marsh assets was something he found distasteful, and that as far as he was concerned, I was a temporary arrangement in his son's life, regardless of what Thomas believed. Thomas's mother, Helen, had been different. She was a quiet woman with Thomas's same dark eyes and a gentle, slightly apologetic manner that I came to understand was years of careful management around her husband's moods. She had been kind to me from the beginning, not effusively, not in the way that feels performative, but in the small, consistent ways that mean more. She had remembered that I didn't take sugar in my coffee, had asked once about a difficult project I'd mentioned, and remembered the outcome months later, had touched my arm on our second Christmas at the Marsh house and said, very quietly, "He'll come around. He's just frightened of things he can't control." I had not known what to say to that. I had said thank you and meant it, and I had loved Helen Marsh in the uncomplicated way you love people who are simply kind to you when they don't have to be. Helen had died 18 months before Gerald, a stroke, quick and without much warning, in early March of the year before last. The loss had changed Gerald in ways that were hard to describe. It had not softened him exactly, but it had removed the moderating influence Helen had always provided, the quiet ballast that had kept his sharper edges from cutting everyone around him. In the last year of his life, he had become more remote, more difficult, and, I understand now in retrospect, more determined, more focused on whatever it was he was planning. Thomas and I had been married for 4 years by the time Gerald died. We lived in a flat in the city, a 2-bedroom on the 6th floor of a building that got good morning light and had a small balcony where I kept 3 terracotta pots of herbs that I tended with a devotion I found slightly embarrassing. I made French press coffee every morning while Thomas got dressed, and I drank the first cup standing at the kitchen window, watching the street below come alive. Delivery vans, a woman walking a greyhound, the particular yellow of early light on wet pavement. And for most of those 4 years, my life had felt like something I had made carefully and was allowed to keep. The years with Gerald's hostility had been difficult, and I would not pretend otherwise. There had been dinners that ended in Thomas's stony silence in the car home. Phone calls I had overheard from the next room that Thomas would not summarize afterward. A particular Christmas 2 years in, when Gerald had made a comment at the table about women who marry into money that had gone briefly and horribly unanswered by everyone present, including my husband. But I had learned to manage it. I had told myself it was the price of being with Thomas, whom I genuinely loved, and that one difficult man at the periphery of our lives was not the same as a broken marriage. I had been, I understand now, managing rather than seeing. There is a difference. Gerald died on a Tuesday in October. It was not unexpected. He had been ill for several months, a cardiac condition that had worsened through the summer. But it was still jarring in the way that death is always jarring, regardless of preparation. The sudden, permanent absence where a person used to be. Thomas flew to Whitfield for the last week, stayed in the family home, handled the arrangements. I joined him for 3 days around the funeral, then returned to work because there was a quarterly review I could not reasonably miss, and because, frankly, Thomas seemed to want to handle his father's death in the particular, private way he handled most difficult things, quietly, without me too close. I had told myself this was grief. Thomas's grief had always had a sealed quality, an inwardness that I had come to accept as personality rather than symptom. I flew back to the city on a Thursday. I kissed him at the airport and said, "Call me tonight." And he said, "I will." And he did. And his voice on the phone was exhausted and flat. And he said there was a lot of paperwork, that it would take a few weeks to sort out, that the solicitor had been in touch about the will. "Is there anything complicated?" I asked. There was a pause, brief, perhaps 2 seconds, but I noticed it the way you notice a missed step in the dark. "It's straightforward," Thomas said. "There are just some things to organize." I believed him. I noted the pause, and I set it aside, and I believed him. And I went to sleep that night in our flat with the city humming below me and the herbs on the balcony catching the last of the evening light. And I thought, this is just grief, and grief takes time, and we will come out the other side of it, and our life will continue the way it has been. I was wrong, of course, but I would not know how wrong for another 6 weeks. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Monday morning in mid-November. Thomas had told me it was just a formality. Dad left everything to me. It's simple, but the solicitor has to do the official reading. It's just how it works. And I had taken the morning off work and put on a dark blazer and driven with Thomas to a solicitor's office in the business district, a quiet building with a beige waiting room and a receptionist who spoke in a near whisper, as though the whole enterprise of death and its paperwork required a lower register of voice. The solicitor's name was Penrose, a compact, gray-haired man with the kind of careful neutrality that is either innate or professionally cultivated over decades. He had laid a folder on the table, offered us both water, and settled into his chair with the quiet economy of a man who has done this many times and has learned that the best approach is simply to read, clearly and without inflection, and let the words do what they are going to do. I remember the room very clearly. The window behind Penrose was slightly fogged at the corners, condensation from the cold outside. The table between us was dark wood, polished, with a faint grain visible in the overhead light. Thomas sat to my left, and I had reached for his hand when we sat down, and he had not exactly pulled away, but his hand had been inert in mine, neither warm nor cold, simply present without pressure, the hand of someone who was elsewhere. I had noticed this and filed it under grief and nerves and this is a difficult day for him, and continued to hold it. Penrose read the opening clauses of the will, the formal language that says, I, Gerald William Marsh, being of sound mind, and I was not really listening yet, not fully. I was watching Thomas's profile, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes were fixed on the table rather than the solicitor, and I was thinking, after this we'll get lunch, something warm, and we'll talk about the next steps with the properties, and it will be all right. Then Penrose read the primary bequest. He read it once. Then there was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and I thought, that cannot be what he said. And then Penrose looked up briefly, just a glance, and I understood that it was. Gerald Marsh had left his entire estate, the family home, the 3 rental properties, the savings portfolio, not to Thomas, not jointly to Thomas and Anna. To Thomas, yes, but with a formal legal addendum attached, a codicil that had been added 14 months before Gerald's death and witnessed by 2 separate parties, which stipulated that in the event Thomas was married at the time of Gerald's death, the estate was to be placed in a discretionary trust administered solely by Thomas, from which Anna Marsh, named specifically, my full name on the document, Anna Catherine Marsh, née Bridwell, was explicitly excluded from any benefit, any claim, or any entitlement whatsoever. The language was precise and deliberate and clearly written with legal assistance. It was not a vague expression of preference. It was a watertight, professionally constructed document whose entire purpose was to ensure that I received nothing and had no legal basis to challenge that outcome. My hands were flat on the table. I became aware of them with a strange clinical detachment, pale against the dark wood, very still, not shaking, which surprised me. I had always imagined that a moment like this would produce an immediate, visible reaction, trembling or tears or the collapse that people describe in these situations. Instead, there was a cold, spreading clarity, like cold water moving through my chest, like the particular silence that comes after a very loud sound has stopped. I could hear the heating system in the walls. I could hear Penrose's pen against the folder as he turned a page. I could hear, or imagined I could hear, Thomas breathing beside me. Careful, measured breaths, the breathing of someone trying not to be visible. I turned to look at him. He was looking at the table. "Thomas," I said. My voice came out level. I was genuinely surprised by how level it was. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes met mine for just a moment. Pale gray eyes that I had loved for 6 years, that I had watched across cafe tables and woken up to on ordinary Tuesday mornings, and watched fill with tears when his mother died. And in that moment I saw something in them that I will not be able to fully describe and will not be able to entirely forget. It was not guilt, exactly. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is relieved in some terrible way to have it finally put down. "You knew," I said. He looked at the table again. Thomas, still level, still calm. The cold water was still moving. "You knew about this." "Anna," he said quietly, "not here. I need you to tell me, not here." His voice was low, almost a murmur, and he glanced toward Penrose with an expression that was part embarrassment and part something I couldn't name. Penrose had gone very still with the careful neutrality of someone who has been in this room many times and knows to become furniture when necessary. I looked at my hands on the table. I thought, with sudden and vivid clarity, he said it was straightforward. He had sat in our kitchen 6 weeks ago and told me the estate was straightforward. There was just paperwork. It would take some time. And I had stood at the counter with my coffee and believed him. Because why would I not believe him? Because we had been married for 4 years, and I had shared a bed with this man and told him things I had told no one else. And somewhere between then and now, he had known that his father had written me out of the picture with legal precision, and he had chosen, every day for 6 weeks, to say nothing. I picked up my glass of water and drank it slowly. I set it down. I said, "Please continue, Mr. Penrose," and my voice was the voice of someone who is still inside their own body and intends to remain there. Penrose continued. There were further details: the trust instrument, the administration process, the timelines for property transfer. I listened to all of it. I took in every word. I asked one clarifying question about the codicil because I needed to understand when it had been signed and who had witnessed it. And Penrose answered with quiet precision. Signed 14 months before Gerald's death, witnessed by a neighbor named Robert Callow and by a second party whose name I did not recognize. Notarized at this very office by a junior solicitor now on maternity leave. 14 months before Gerald's death. That meant it had been signed while Helen was still alive. No, wait. I calculated quickly. Helen had died 18 months ago. Gerald had signed this document 4 months after his wife's death, alone in the house in Whitfield with a neighbor and a hired witness, and nobody had thought to tell me. When the meeting was over, Thomas stood and shook Penrose's hand with a brevity that was itself a kind of confession. And I stood and did the same, and we walked out through the beige waiting room and through the glass door and into the cold November air. The street was gray. There was a smell of rain and exhaust and the particular flatness of a city in November, stripped of summer color. I stood on the pavement, and I did not speak. I was waiting for Thomas to say something, to begin at least some version of the explanation that I was owed. He stood beside me with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the street, and the silence stretched between us for long enough that a woman with a pushchair walked past us, and a taxi pulled up to the curb and released a passenger and drove away. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked. "Anna, when?" The word came out harder than I intended. "Not before the meeting, clearly. Were you going to tell me afterward? Or were you going to let me read through the trust documents on my own and piece it together?" Thomas exhaled. The breath was visible in the cold air, a small white cloud that dissipated immediately. "I found out 6 weeks ago," he said. "I went through Dad's papers after the funeral, and I found the codicil in his desk. I should have told you straight away. I know that. I needed time to figure out how to tell your wife that your father had spent 14 months constructing a legal document specifically designed to exclude her from your family's estate." "He was ill," Thomas said. He'd always had strange ideas about—" "Don't." I turned to face him fully now, and I saw him register the expression on my face and adjust slightly, the way a person adjusts when they realize the conversation is more serious than they had prepared for. "Don't explain his motives to me as though I don't understand them. I understand his motives perfectly. I have understood his motives for 6 years. What I don't understand is yours." He didn't answer. The gray street moved around us. Somewhere nearby, a bus pulled away from a stop with a long hydraulic exhale. "Come home," Thomas said. "Let me explain everything at home." I stood there for one more moment, looking at the man I had married, and I thought, yes, let's go home. Let's have the conversation. All of it. Because I had the faint, cold, barely formed suspicion, born in that meeting room from the way Penrose had turned that page, from the way Thomas had not looked at me, from the particular shape of his relief, that the codicil was not the whole story, that there were more pages in Gerald Marsh's folder, that the document I had just heard read aloud was perhaps not the worst thing in it. I was right, but I would not know how right until Thomas opened his laptop that evening and showed me something he had been hiding for 6 weeks, and the ground beneath what I thought was my life gave way entirely. We drove home without speaking. The city moved past the windows, gray pavements, shop fronts, a woman at a bus stop with a paper coffee cup pressed between her palms, and I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap and watched it all with the peculiar detachment of a person who is still processing the exact dimensions of what has just happened to them. I was not yet angry. The anger was there, fully formed and waiting, but it was behind something else right now, something cold and clear and precise that felt more useful. I needed to understand everything before I allowed myself to feel everything. Thomas parked the car. We rode the lift to the 6th floor in silence. He unlocked the flat door, and I walked in ahead of him, dropped my bag on the kitchen counter, and stood at the window looking at the street below, the same view I had looked at every morning for 4 years. I heard Thomas hang up his coat. I heard him fill a glass of water. I heard him stand somewhere behind me, not speaking. I turned around. "Tell me everything," I said. "Not the version where you were trying to protect me. The version where you tell me what you actually knew and when you actually knew it." He set the glass down and looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. There was a tiredness in his face that I had been reading as grief for weeks and was now reading differently. Not the tiredness of a man in mourning, but the tiredness of a man who has been carrying a lie and is approaching the moment when putting it down is the only remaining option. "I found the codicil the week after Dad died," he said, "in his desk in a folder with the property deeds. I didn't know what to do with it." "You could have told me," I said, "that same evening." "I know." "Thomas, 6 weeks." "I know." He looked at the counter. "I spoke to Penrose off the record. I thought maybe there was a way to restructure things, to make it right without you having to know what he'd written." I looked at my husband and thought, "You were going to manage this, handle it quietly, and present me with a clean version." I said, "You were going to tell me your father left everything in a trust and simply not explain why I was excluded?" He said, quietly, that he had planned to decline the inheritance entirely, turn it over to charity. If he refused the estate, there was nothing to explain. I stared at him. "That is not the point," I said, and my voice had gone very still. "The point is that your father spent 14 months constructing a legal document to exclude me, and your instinct was not to tell your wife, but to make it disappear, as though the thing that needed managing was my feelings, not the truth." "Yes," he said, after a long pause. "That's what I was going to do." I turned back to the window. I pressed my fingertips against the cold glass and breathed slowly. And I thought about Helen Marsh saying, "He's just frightened of things he can't control." I had always assumed she meant Gerald. Standing at that window, I wondered for the first time whether she had also, quietly, meant her son. "There's something else," Thomas said behind me. He said it in the tone of a man who has finally run out of road. I turned around. He had his laptop open, the screen angled toward me, his expression carrying the particular weight of a person about to add a second wound to a first. "Show me," I said. It was an email chain, Thomas's personal account, not his work account. 14 or 15 messages, the most recent dated 3 days after Gerald's funeral. The correspondents were Thomas and Robert Callow, the neighbor, the witness. The subject line was Dad's wishes. The exchange had begun 2 months before Gerald's death. Callow had written first, at Gerald's apparent request, to relay a message. Gerald intended to add the codicil. He wanted Thomas to know in advance. And, here was the sentence I read 3 times, he wanted Thomas's assurance that Thomas understood and accepted his father's reasoning. Thomas had replied the following day, not to object, not to say, "My father's reasoning is prejudiced and I will not validate it." Thomas had written, "I understand. I hope you can help him feel at peace about his decision." I looked at my husband. "You knew while he was alive," I said. "Anna, you knew before he died. He told you through this man," I gestured at the laptop. "And you wrote back to say you understood." My voice had gone very quiet, the way a room goes quiet before a storm rather than during it. "I was trying to keep peace with him," he said. "He was dying, Anna. He was my father, and he was dying, and there was nothing I could say that would change his mind, and I thought, you thought it would be easier to let him die believing you agreed with him?" I moved around the counter and stood directly in front of him. "That is not keeping peace. That is taking a side." The silence that followed was not like any silence we had had before. It was the silence of something structural, something in the architecture of what I had believed about my marriage becoming visible in a new and irrevocable way. "I need you to leave the flat tonight," I said. He did not argue. He went to the bedroom, packed a bag with the quiet efficiency of a man who had half expected this, and 20 minutes later, the door closed behind him, and I was alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the gray light through the windows and the absolute, ringing clarity of everything I had just learned. I made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something familiar and grounding. And I thought, with cold, methodical focus, what do I actually know, and what can I actually do with it? I called my sister. Then I opened my laptop and searched for a solicitor. Not Penrose, who was Gerald's man, but an independent family law specialist. I sent an email requesting an urgent consultation. I gave my full name, Anna Catherine Marsh, née Bridwell, the name Gerald had written into his document with such deliberate precision. I hit send. The solicitor's name was Diana O'Say, and she was extraordinarily good at her job. She reviewed everything Penrose had provided and confirmed that the codicil was legally airtight. No challenge could be mounted on the document itself. But then she asked me whether I had ever contributed financially to any of the Marsh estate assets. I thought about it and remembered. 3 years earlier, I had loaned Gerald £12,000 from our joint savings for emergency roof repairs on one of his rental properties. He had repaid $8,000. The remaining $4,000 had never been settled. Diana made a note. Then she showed me something she had found in the estate documentation. One of Gerald's rental properties, the one whose roof I had helped repair, had 2 valuations on file. The first was standard, recent, professional. The second had been conducted 4 months before Gerald's death by a different firm and was lower than the first by a significant margin. The instructing party on the second valuation was not Gerald. It was Thomas. I sat in Diana's office and felt something that was no longer cold clarity, but something sharper. A stone put down in water, settling. Thomas had instructed a lower valuation of an estate property while his father was still alive, 4 months before the death. Diana explained it precisely. A lower valuation created a lower taxable base, which benefited the trust's sole beneficiary. The beneficiary was Thomas. He had not merely accepted the codicil passively. He had been an active participant in the financial architecture of the estate that would exclude me, managing its tax implications before his father was in the ground. The 6 weeks of silence after the funeral was not the paralysis of a man who didn't know how to break difficult news. It was the continuation of a process he had been engaged in for months. What followed took 3 months. Thomas and I met twice a week throughout that period in the kitchen of the flat that was both of ours, talking with the painful honesty of 2 people deciding whether what remains of something is worth keeping. There were evenings when I felt, simultaneously, love and grief and a final cold anger, all 3 present at once, occupying the same space without canceling each other out. That is the specific texture of certain betrayals. It does not erase what was real. It sits alongside it and asks you to hold both. Thomas told me, eventually, everything. He had known about the codicil for 4 months before Gerald's death. He had raised it once with his father, and Gerald had said, "If you push this, I'll change it to a charitable foundation, and neither of you gets a penny." Thomas had backed down. He had instructed the lower valuation and told himself it was responsible estate management. He had come home and drunk French press coffee with me and said nothing. "You chose the path of least resistance at every single decision point," I said when he finished, "and you dressed it up as protecting me." "Yes," he said. "I don't think you're a bad person," I said, and I meant it. "I think you're a person who learned, in that house, that the easiest way to manage difficulty was to manage around it rather than through it. That habit nearly cost you your marriage." He looked up. "Nearly," he said. Nearly, I confirmed, depending on what you do now. What Thomas did. He confirmed in writing, to Diana, the full history of his involvement. He waived his claim to the rental property, whose valuation he had manipulated, transferring his interest to a joint account. He repaid the £4,000 with interest. He wrote a formal letter to Robert Callow, copy to Diana, stating that he did not endorse the process by which the codicil had been witnessed. And he sat across from me in that kitchen and said, with the difficulty of a truth long avoided, "I was afraid of him my whole life. I'm sorry that I let that fear become something I did to you." 6 months later, Thomas and I are still in the flat. The herbs on the balcony have been replanted. The basil didn't survive winter, but the rosemary is extraordinary, dark and dense. I drink my coffee at the kitchen window most mornings, and most mornings Thomas comes and stands beside me, and we look at the street together, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we don't, and both are fine. I did not get the Marsh estate. Gerald's scheme worked, technically, in the narrow legal sense. What I got instead was the truth, in full. The £4,000 returned, a husband who is slowly learning to move through difficulty rather than around it, and a clearer understanding of my own marriage than I had on the morning I walked into Penrose's office, believing the afternoon would be a formality. I think about Gerald sometimes, not with warmth, but with a dispassionate curiosity about what it must have cost him to spend the last year of his life building a legal argument against a woman he had never bothered to know. All that precision, all that planning, the codicil, the language, the advanced coordination, the valuation, all of it in service of making sure that I received nothing. He had put more deliberate effort into excluding me than he had ever put into understanding me. The rosemary on the balcony smells extraordinary this year. The coffee is hot. The morning belongs entirely to me, and that, after all of it, turns out to be enough.